Oh, thank you, welcome. Yes, poisonous polyps and toxic tinies. I know it hasn't been much of a summer yet, but has anybody been to the beach these holidays? That's very good, excellent. I think one audience member already knows what those blue things there are.
What are they?
What? Jellyfish?
Blue bottle.
Blue bottle jellyfish. Does anybody know where this beach is, by any chance? Anybody reckon? Well done. Mount Maunganui. Yes, indeed. I don't actually know when this Yeah, oh, that's right. As I say, I don't know whether when the picture was taken, but it is Mount Maunganui. I hear that the Bay of Plenty people are also having to deal with lots of blue bottles from time to time. One of my colleagues who came back from holidays last week said that Ohope Beach was closed several times because of blue bottle wash-ups. So, what's a blue bottle?
Wow.
We tend to call them jellyfish, and actually I have to say we're not allowed to call jellyfish anymore because the fish people get upset because they don't have backbones. They're not fish. Like we're not supposed to call starfish anymore. We're supposed to call them sea stars. And jellyfish we're supposed to call sea jellies or jellies. So, I'm sorry. So I was going to say if I get it wrong, just pull me up, okay? So blue bottles. We look at one of these blue bottles as a single animal, as an individual, but they're not actually. They're a colony of thousands and thousands and thousands of little polyps. And there's about 4 different types of polyps. They're all very specialised. They have different purposes. And some of the polyps make up the float here. And some of the polyps are specialised reproductive system. And then there's the third one, which is the digestive system. And then the fourth ones are the prey capture, the tentacles, which are the bits that are hanging down. So when these things are floating through the surface of the ocean, and those tentacles are hanging down, they're basically like a fishing net. Anybody know how blue bottles capture their prey?
No,
Electrocute them? Yeah, almost. A little bit like them. Like that, they have. Oh, that's right. They, rather than jellies, call them siphonophores, if you can remember. I'll be testing you at the end of this. They have these tentacles that are loaded up with specialised cells called cnidocytes. And each one of those little cells is a package that has a trigger. It's under pressure. It has this arrangement here with a coiled hollow thread, and there's toxin all through here. And then it has these barbed heads tucked in here. And when something swings past, like a prey item, like a small fish or a larval organism that's floating around in the plankton, and it bumps against that trigger, the whole lot, because it's under pressure, fires out, shoots out this little barbed head, and injects this hollow thread through which poison is injected into the prey item, into the small fish. And because it's not just one of these stinging cells, but the tentacles, each tentacle is loaded up with literally millions of these stinging cells. So you come into contact with even a very small portion. It could be quite nasty if you were a small fish. And that small fish is reeled in, and it becomes the function of the digestive polyps to redistribute that little prey bit, has to digest it and to redistribute it to the entire colony for food. Now you can see here, this is a scanning electron microscope image of one of these little cnidocytes after it's been fired, and you can see this nasty little barbed head here and a little thread off to the side. Now, has anybody ever been stung by blue bottles?
You've been stung?
I have fortunately never been stung by any of these, like the jellies or the blue bottles, but have you stood on one? Yeah. Standing is the skin on your feet, and if you were to pick one of these things up, the skin on your fingers is usually tough enough for the little cnidocytes not to be able to, the little barbs not to be able to penetrate your fingers. But because they have those little barbs and they get stuck, and so if you didn't wash your hands, if you after touching one of these, you didn't really wash your hands very, very well in seawater, then and you touched your face or some more sensitive parts of your body, those little cells that hadn't fired off yet, they would still fire, and it could be quite painful. And if you're in the water and you encounter one of these blue bottles and you're unfortunate enough to get some of these trailing tentacles across your arms or your midriff or your legs, then the results could be really rather nasty. And this is a 10-year-old boy, I think it was 8-year-old boy, it doesn't matter, but somebody about your age who was stung by blue bottles. Now, if you're ever stung by blue bottles, do you know what to do?
Vinegar.
Yeah. Everybody says vinegar, but no, because scientists have now, doctors actually, I think, more likely, they've done tests, and vinegar is one of the worst things you can use. Sorry, you can't take the vinegar with you to the beach. So is fresh water, because what happens is the vinegar and the fresh water make any cells that haven't gone off yet, it makes those burst as well, and then the situation is even worse. What you're supposed to do is, in the first instance, wash the area down really well with salt water, which there's plenty of that in the sea. So don't rub sand, don't use your hands to rub really hard, but just try and wash as much of the stuff off with salt water. And then hot water, not so hot that you can burn yourself, but a good hot shower, 40 to 45 degrees centigrade. So a good hot shower, or failing that, I guess a bowl with really hot water, just about as hot as you can stand, and that denatures, that destroys the toxin that was in those little cnidocytes. And of course, I think if I looked like that, I'd go to the doctor actually, and hope that the doctor had something else to help me. Other things that have little cnidocyte stinging cells are jellies, and you might have seen these guys on the beach. Yeah, so they're very common. Fortunately, those guys don't have the long trailing tentacles, so it's not such an issue. But if you were to turn it upside down and you touch the other side, I would still advise you to wash your hands, not to touch your face, just in case. Other creatures that you might frequently see on the beach are sea anemones. They also have stinging cells. I've got some in here which I collected on the weekend, and after the talk you're welcome to come and have a look. And there's one of these large ones, this one, camouflage anemone. You're welcome to stick your finger in, see what it feels like for stinging cells to go off. These guys are so tiny that the fingers on your skin are really quite tough. So it'll feel like a bit of Velcro, a little bit of sort of sticky tape. It won't hurt. So anybody who's brave enough, I dare you to. Okay? There's a little thing called Glaucus atlanticus, or sometimes called the sea swallow, I believe. We find those in New Zealand waters, particularly up north as well. This little creature, and I've got these ones you can come and have a look after. I've got a few from our collections in here. You can see just how tiny they are. The food of Glaucus is blue bottles. They have developed some sort of immunity to the toxin in the blue bottles. But not only that, when they graze on the blue bottles, they harvest some of the cnidocytes But they don't just harvest any old lidocyte, they harvest the most toxic ones, the most poisonous ones, and they store those in these sort of appendages here. And so they become toxic themselves. And so the toxin is presumably for defensive purposes, because if you're floating around on the surface of the ocean, you're pretty much a target for any fish or bird that's passing. So if you're unpalatable, if you're toxic, those predators will learn very quickly that if they nip a bit off that it's not very nice at all. So in effect, that little glaucus, though you wouldn't come into contact with them, I guess, or you certainly wouldn't eat them, I hope, but they are even more poisonous than the bluebottles themselves, because they only take the most poisonous stinging cells from the bluebottle. Something else that uses a sort of a harpoon or stinging mechanism is the cone shells. I have some here. That's Conus geographus, which is this specimen here out of our collections. Now, there are many different types of cones, and some are quite small. Like, this is sort of all the medium size, I guess.
You find those on the beach, don't you?
And all of the cones are very, very poisonous. They have about, I think, 200 different products that they store as they're called conotoxins. About 200 or so different varieties amongst the whole group of cones. I don't think that every cone has 200 different toxins, but amongst the group there is a huge variety of toxins. And the little ones, the little cones, use the toxin to capture prey, which is mostly other mollusks, other shells.
How do they do that? Do they send out a tentacle?
Yeah, I'll show you.
Oh.
And the larger ones eat fish. They go after fish, and it's the larger ones which are the most dangerous ones, like Conus geographus. And Conus geographus is one of the most poisonous ones, if possibly the most poisonous one. And the way they do that is they fire out a cone dart.
Wow.
And so here is the shell, and then that's the siphon, which it uses to taste the water with and look for prey. It has eyes, but it doesn't really use those to look for the prey. I think it sort of tastes or senses for prey through movement. And then that is the proboscis. And at the end, at the midpoint of the proboscis is this sac which houses this rather mean-looking dart. And for the larger specimens, I think the dart is something like about 1 centimetre, so it's fair size, I would think. And then here we have this little sac which contains the conotoxins. So when the cone is looking for food and it senses some prey, you can see these things. If you go on YouTube, there are plenty of videos showing cone shells hunting and darting prey. And so when it senses a fish, it fires out, and in a fraction of a second it fires out this dart and skewers the fish. And the toxin is so powerful that it really only takes a matter of seconds before the fish is paralysed. Now, as far as I know, the toxicity of cones, I think over the last 20 or 30 years there have been about 15 human deaths from cone shell poisonings. With the blue bottles, I think in New Zealand every year, if there are blue bottles around, undoubtedly people will, there will be people who will get serious sort of, I would almost call them rashes, burns, whatever, from the blue bottles, the stings from the blue bottles. But in Australia, where it's warmer, where you probably have far more blue bottles, where people tend to spend more time on the beach, I think every year there's something like 10,000 people who get seriously affected by blue bottles. However, a cone shell I think unless you're really old or you're quite young or you may be sick, you have an immune system that's not functioning well, then I think the blue bottles are not such a danger. But cone shells definitely are, particularly those larger cones. And the problem with those ones is that there is no anti-venom. So if you get stung by one of those, all the doctor can do is to stick you on life support and see, hope for the best for the next few days. Vincent asked yesterday about cone shells in New Zealand, and I said, no, I don't think we have any. What our New Zealand cone shells are from the Kermadec. However, looking at the collections, I did find one from Paringaringa Harbour, which was collected, I think, I'm not even sure, it doesn't give a date here, but from the labelling and everything, it's been in our collections for quite a few years, so maybe 40, 50, 60 years, something like that, so Paringaringa. And then I also found there was a herald reference to a cone shell that was found at the Pornight Islands a few years ago, I think 2003 or 4, something like that. So we do get cone shells here periodically, possibly when the water is a bit warmer and they come down as larvae on the East Australia current. You might find them in the north and around the Pornights. So, but keep your eyes open. Now, these guys use darts or harpoons, stinging cells. These guys here have hollow spines filled with toxin, and this one here is from the Pornight Islands, and it's an unusually large one, particularly for New Zealand. But you may possibly find the occasional fireworm on New Zealand beaches as well. However, if you do, they're much more likely to be about that size, not this size. Happy?
5
Okay. The reason why they're called fireworms is that if you were unfortunate enough to pick one of them up and you got the spines embedded in your fingers, it's like burning sensation. It is apparently incredibly painful. It's not fatal, but it's not very pleasant. And if you can avoid it, don't touch these guys, the really spiny ones, particularly if they've got this lovely orange. Another group that you might come across with problem spines, they're called collapsible sea urchins, or sometimes called tam o'shanter, after the sort of the Scottish headgear. That's a photograph, a really deep sea photograph of one, because they inflate through hydrostatic pressure, and you take the water away and they collapse. That's why they don't have much of a skeleton. Not like the kenna, they don't have much of a hard skeleton. So they're quite soft, and if there's no water there to hold them up, then they collapse. That's of course why they're called collapsible sea urchins. You're not likely to find these on the beaches, really, even in shallow water. They tend to be more a deep water thing, sort of 200, 300 or more metres. But they come up in fish trawls often. Once the fishermen who go trawling close to the seafloor, sometimes they get those in their nets, and that's certainly how we got those in our collections. So there's a jar of these ones here as well. You can come and have a look at later. And then we have kenna, and we have this one, which is also, there's a jar of this one in the poisonous exhibition as well. You can look for that, diadema. And these guys, if you were to touch them, or even a kenna, if you were unfortunate enough to get a kenna spine in your finger, it's better to get it out, because there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that even kenna have a bit of toxin in the skin that surrounds the spines. And I guess that makes them more unpalatable for fish to eat. We might put a few fish off, so it's probably again a defensive thing. So I brought along a few kenna here as well. Anybody ever seen one of these? That's good, isn't it? That's unusual these days anyway. This one comes from Stewart Island, and again it doesn't have a date when it was collected, but it was collected by Mrs. Harrison, and I know that Mrs. Harrison used to collect for Dr. Powell, who was the curator here many years ago, and she used to collect in about the 1930s or so. So this specimen is probably about 80 or so years old. Deadly discovery. Anybody want to guess what that refers to? On Auckland beaches? What's deadly on Auckland beaches?
People. To dogs or people? Yeah, besides people. Yeah.
Besides people?
Oh, sea slugs.
A toxic sea slug. Anybody got dogs? Okay. Right. You really should know what a toxic sea slug looks like. In about 2009, I guess a couple of years, 3 years ago now, in the middle of the year, there was suddenly a lot of dogs dying on Auckland beaches, and so people started to get really worried, and people from the ARC and DOC looking for the cause of these dog deaths, and it was thought that it was some sort of poison that the dogs were eating. And so Cawthron Institute in Nelson, who have all the expertise for the toxic algae, the testing of waters for seafood industry, they sent some of their scientists up, and they went along Auckland beaches collecting anything, particularly in those areas where there had been the most dog deaths, like Bucklands Beach, I think, and Narrowneck. And they sent their scientists along, and they collected just about anything and everything that they thought a dog might be interested in. And then they went back to Cawthron and they did their testing. And at the same time, there were a lot of pilchards washing up, and I think there were some blue penguins washing up as well, and I think there had been a couple of dolphin deaths. And so people were really, really worried, and there might be something in the water even. And so the scientists from Cawthron did their tests, and they found everything was negative. The pilchards had apparently died from a thing called Pilchard's herpes virus, which arrives every so often, and the penguins were all juveniles, and they'd starved to death pretty much. They hadn't learned how to feed properly, perhaps, but the dolphins, I'm not sure why the dolphins died, and I don't know if they had ever found the cause. But with the dog deaths, some of the dogs they'd actually got the stomach contents, and so they tested those as well. And all the creatures that they tested, it was everything from sea slugs to shellfish to kinna to sea squirts. All these things that they tested, the sea slug was off the scale, so poisonous. And what they've also found was that it wasn't just this, in the meantime, is that not just the sea slug that's poisonous, but it's also the eggs that the sea slug lays. And so those dogs that died may have come into contact with either a sea slug on the beach, or even picked up some seaweed with sea slug eggs on it. And the poison that they found in the sea slugs is the same poison that's found in a number of other creatures, like the blue-ringed octopus in Australia, the fugu fish, which is eaten in Japan, and chefs have to study for about 7 years or so before they can prepare these things. And then there's a little thing called a rough-skinned newt from the Americas, which also has the same poison, and this lovely little frog from Panama, the golden frog. And the poison is called Tetradotoxin, and Tetradotoxin is a really, really nasty neurotoxin which acts on your nerve cells, and it does so by blocking all the electrical messages so that your nerve cells can't send messages to your muscles anymore. But it doesn't just, there we go, it doesn't just affect, it doesn't affect all of your muscles, it only affects your motor muscles, like your arms and your legs, and your diaphragm even, but not your heart, and it doesn't affect your brain, which is very nasty. So you become paralyzed, but you're still conscious. And most people would die, and it really is a very, very potent toxin. Most people die from asphyxiation because their diaphragm stops working, and so they can't breathe anymore. So your heart's still ticking, your brain's still working, you can't move anything, and you can't breathe, which is, I think, a particularly nasty way to do it. And in Japan, because people, it's a bit like Russian roulette, really, with the fugu fish. You know, have these special restaurants where they dish up fugu fish, and apparently every year, people who don't go to restaurants but who prepare the fugu fish themselves at home or something, they get a little bit too much of the flesh, or particularly the liver, because a lot of the toxin is stored in the liver. They get a little bit too much of the tetrodotoxin, and somebody dies. And I think in Japan it's law that if there's suspected tetrodotoxin poisoning, you're not allowed to bury people for 4 days, because it takes about 4 days for the poison to work out of your system. And people have been known to recover.
Oh, wow.
And the reason why this toxin is so terrible is because there is no known antidote. So if you are poisoned by tetrodotoxin, the only thing they can do is to really stick you on life support and keep you alive, and hope that your major organs like your kidneys and your liver don't stop functioning. Now the question we often get is there something new? You know, why is it happening now? Is there something new? Specimens in our collections. When we heard about the toxic sea slugs, we went to our collections and said, well, we've got a number of historical specimens, would you like to test those? Because the question was, you know, why is it happening now? Is there something new? Is it global warming? Is it pollutants in the harbour, or a ship that's discharged its bilges and put something in the water into our harbour? And so we gave them specimens from our collections that have been in our collections for a while, and we gave them a specimen that had been collected, because the problem started in 2009, or was identified in 2009, and we gave them a specimen from 2007, sent it off, they tested it, and it was toxic. So then we knew that these slugs had already been toxic for 2 years. We sent them a specimen, or actually we didn't send the specimen, because the tetrodotoxin is soluble in water and in alcohol, and we sent them just a teaspoon of the liquid from a specimen that was collected in 1994, probably before most of you were born, yes? Yeah. 1994 from Eola Reef, and that was also very, very toxic. So then we knew that these things have been toxic for quite a long time, for a couple of decades, probably always, forever, but we'd never really recognised that this little slug was toxic. So why is it a problem now? Well, some decades ago, this little Asian date mussel was brought into as an invasive species into the harbour. It was brought in by accident, and that settled in our harbour, and it makes these huge beds of, I think in Auckland Harbour they've measured them up, and they've measured them at something like 16,000 per square metre. Now what's a metre? That's about an area about there. You have 16,000 of these little mussels. So they are really jammed in together. And those little mussels live for about 2 or 3 years, and then they die. And when they die, they have food for lots of things, like sea stars and our toxic sea slug, our Pleurobranchia maculata, which is an opportunistic carnivore. So anything that it comes across that it thinks is food, it'll eat it. When I went down to Cawthron Institute last year for a workshop, and they had a tank. They told us they had a tank of 5 of these guys the night before. When they came in the morning and they showed us the tank, there were only 4. So they'll eat each other. So these guys are hungry. And so in Auckland Harbour we now have this Asian date mussel, and particularly around Narrowneck and the Tamaki estuary, Bucklands Beach, we have lots of these guys. And so those are the areas also where we had the dog deaths, the hot spots for the dog deaths, because there were lots of these guys feeding on those guys. Right? So that's an explanation. And what happens with these, because they live only about 2 or 3 years at most, and often when they spawned, do you have a late night? You're on holiday. But often when they have spawned, they die, and they end up washing up with a bit of onshore wind. They end up washing up on our beaches, and so that's where you get the contact with dogs, of course, because people like to take their dogs to the beach, and these guys on the beach. And so I know my dogs will pick up anything and everything. You would have to ingest it, so you have to eat it. You cannot absorb it through your skin.
Right. That's good.
I was going to ask actually, how many people do you think this would kill? This specimen here. This specimen, say it's about yay big.
5.
Okay. Who's around about sort of 30 kilos? Do you know your body weights? Is it about 30? Yeah. Okay, you're dead. I think you're dead. 5, you're dead. That's 6. I think Mum's dead. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2 more. You're dead too. So I could knock off half this room easily. So guys, be nice. Why would sea creatures be poisonous? Why, if you were, how would you use the poison? Defense? Yep, definitely. And what did the blue bottles do? They used it to attack prey. Yeah. So, because the question we often have is, with the sea slug, why is it poisonous? Actually, I'm not sure that we really know the answer. It doesn't use the poison to attack anything, because it just eats everything that's in its way. It might use it for defence, but if you're so poisonous that everything that eats you, there's not a lot of learning involved, because your victim is dead, and it can't sort of learn from eating you. And so whether this is for defence or not, we don't actually know yet, but that's what they're going to be looking at as well at Cawthron, to see if they can sort of tease out why is it poisonous, where does it make the poison, is another question that they will be investigating, because really we don't know. At the moment it looks like the entire organism is, the entire creature is poisonous. The fugu fish, it seems that it uses bacteria that are in parts of the perhaps in the gut, or that they make the poison. And the second generation, because the fugu fish they have bred them in captivity, and the second generation is without a toxin. So it looks like the fish itself doesn't actually manufacture a toxin. It might be something else that's associated, like a bacterium. If that's the same story with this guy, we don't really know. They've tested, it's another thing that Cawthron are doing, they're testing how far this moves into the food chain. and there are traces in some mollusks, but not enough to be worrying just yet. Anyway, but they are looking. Now, another question. Looking at these guys here, which is the most toxic? If we had this end here of okay, don't worry about it, to that end, wow, that's definitely going to kill you. Out of these specimens, anybody want to tell me which they consider to be the least toxic?
The least.
The least poisonous, the least toxic. The least, not much of a worry, really. Killer? Okay. Do you think so? It's a bit of a nuisance, really, if you get stung and you get a prickle and that's okay. The killer. What about the blue bottles? Where would they sit? Which end?
A little bit to the dangerous side in the middle.
Somewhere over here? Maybe? Right. What about at the far end? Okay, I totally agree. I'm not going to argue with that one. We just have a few jellies here. What about? Oh no, that's our blue bottles. Sorry, our blue bottles. Where would we sit our blue bottles? That's why we have the blue bottles in it. I picked up the wrong jar. I'm sorry. Our jellies. Where would the jellies sit? In the middle. Okay. The fireworm. Remember that one? Towards the end, you think? Somewhere over here? Do you think it'd be worse than the blue bottles? Okay. All right. What about this guy? The collapsible one? You're not going to come into contact with it? Okay. All right. These guys, the glaucus, which feeds on the blue bottles.
So beyond the blue bottles.
Beyond the blue bottles. Okay. Cool. What about our anemone?
It's not poisonous because we touch.
Yeah. Can it stay there?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Cone shells?
They can go down there.
They're cone shells because they've killed at least 15 people. Yeah? Okay. You happy with that? Right. There you go. Well done. Now, finally, you can come up and have a look and have a touch. Until about a week ago, we did have a live specimen of our toxic sea slug, but he spawned and died. So our lovely research associate has made a model, and it shows pretty much the size and the shape. So have a good look, because particularly if you're a dog owner, it's important that you know what these guys look like. And I've also put down some of the musculus, some of the date mussels, so you can go down to the beach and see if you find date mussels.
Before you do your exploration, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Wilma Blom, and I think it's been really interesting. I'll be putting my toe in a little bit more cautiously.
Yeah, I would say forget about the sharks.
Yeah.